Hey, Zach.
Long time no see.
How are you?
Pretty good.
Good. Did you have a good did you have a good break?
Yes. How was your break?
It was good. I um a good portion of it I spent grading and I still didn't get all my grading done, but it was good. My wife's birthday was over the break, and so we spent a couple of days celebrating that. One of the days we went down to Santa Cruz, which isn't too far away, and went boogie boarding with a colleague of mine at the OHS and her husband. So that was fun. The waves were pretty big and scary, and at one point we actually got the lifeguard came over and told us, "You guys need to move down the beach to a safer area because it was a little too rough." Um, and then uh, on another evening, we went over to this summer we're going to Japan, and so one of my colleagues is Japanese, and so he's offered to sort of get us used to Japanese food and Japanese culture and stuff like that. And so he invited us over, and we had a whole big sashimi dinner, right, all kinds of raw fish. And I don't typically eat fish at all, no seafood, much less raw food. So this was a real challenge for us, but we wanted to be good sports, and uh, we ate everything they had to give us. So it was fun though. It was fun and it was good time and it was interesting. So
Are you learning any Japanese?
a little bit, yeah. Um, he's he's teaching me some basic phrases. Um, so delicious is oishi. Oishi. Um, what else? Uh, so to say I am Morgan, I would say watashi wa Morgan desu. Um, anata wa Zaku desu.
Yes, we love
That's
that.
you are Zach. Hey guys,
Hey. Hello.
long time no see.
Okay.
Jinx. Jinx are there.
All right, let me. Here we go.
All these bags. I love the Kinder Egg. I didn't know this was supposed to get enough or something.
What'd you get?
I got this. Got a little ghost.
Oh yeah.
So,
How
10
was
o'clock.
How was your break?
Yeah, I was just talking with Zach a little bit about it. It had its high points and it had its low points.
Oh.
Low points had to do with lots of grading that I still didn't get completely finished with. High points included boogie boarding in Santa Cruz and having a challenging but interesting sashimi dinner with a Japanese colleague.
What was challenging about it?
Swallowing the food.
Oh, are you not a sushi person?
No, I had never eaten. I hardly ever even eat seafood at all.
Oh, wow. So that must
Yeah.
have been a trip.
It was.
And you were so polite.
We're going to Japan, so we want to. This colleague of mine has offered to sort of introduce us to Japanese cuisine and Japanese culture and stuff like that. So,
Wow.
Yeah.
I'll take your place. I love sushi.
I was actually in Japan, I think 3 or 4 years ago. It's quite hard.
What?
Just like eating and
Why?
living and
Why would eating in Japan? You know, it's not like Japanese
no,
food.
I like it. It's very like light and I don't
It has
you'll
a
see
certain
it.
flavor. Certain...
I love Japanese.
And American Japanese food is a lot heavier than actual Japanese food. Like they don't eat sushi
Right.
They don't meet that much.
Yeah, no, and I found that generally to be true about sashimi is that it was a very light, and the flavors were not as intense. They were more delicate. Is that what you said a minute ago, Alexandra?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
That's okay. So, how about you guys? Do you guys have good breaks?
Oh, break, yes.
Break was okay.
Good break, yep.
Okay.
It was really good.
Yeah. I was never in one place for more than like a day or two, so it was tiring.
Wow.
Oh, where did you go? College?
I just went on like college tour and just traveled around.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, Jacob, you were touring colleges as well, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, well, sorry, what was that, Jacob?
So it's the same thing as saying it's like every 2 days you're just in a different place.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, well, I guess we need to get back to business here for a few more weeks, right? There isn't that much of the semester left, actually. So, okay, well, sorry, my title slide got a little goofed up with the translation. Maybe we'll come back to this image. You guys have probably all heard the story that this image is supposed to be depicting, right? The story of the different blindfolded or blind men feeling an elephant, and each one feels a different part of the elephant, and so says something different about what the nature of the elephant is. And sometimes this kind of story or this little parable or whatever you call these things is used as a way of, I don't know, maybe defending relativism. I actually don't think it does that very well. But maybe we can come back to that anyway. It's the best image I could find for today's topic. So a couple of important reminders before we go on. First of all, now, I said that you had to do this before the break ended, but, I'm a nice guy, so I'm going to give you one more day to let me know the topic for your in-class presentation. And now this is like the presentation that you did last semester, right? So you should look at the topics that are on the course schedule, and you can either do that on eCollege by the little link that says course schedule, or I filled out the rest of the semester in the little weekly tabs on eCollege. So you can look through those as well if you want to see what topics there are. And so it's one of those, and you'll present on one of those. You might send me a couple choices in case one of them has been taken already. And this is different from the presentation you're going to be giving on your research paper topic, okay? That's a separate one. So you guys are all going to be doing two presentations from here on out. So please do look over the schedule and give me a choice by the end of the day. And yeah. Also know that this Sunday night is the first draft, your first draft of your research paper is due. So that's a big one. And speaking of presentations, Zach is signed up for today for his in-class presentation. So he's going to be leading us through the material in a few minutes. But I did want to kind of remind you of what we're doing. So we're nearing the end of our discussion of epistemology, or the philosophy of knowledge. And you'll recall that the main questions of epistemology have to do with the nature of knowledge, what is knowledge, the sources of knowledge, where does knowledge come from, if we have knowledge, the scope or limits of knowledge, how much knowledge do we have, if any at all, right? And finally, the structure of knowledge. And just to remind you what we've sort of looked at in these different areas, the nature of knowledge seems to be justified true belief, plus or minus a little bit, especially regarding that justification clause. There's all kinds of debate about what exactly the nature of justification is, but everyone else seems to agree that true belief true belief is definitely a safe part of the nature of knowledge. Now the sources of knowledge, we've looked at people who have advocated the view that the empiricists who advocate the view that all knowledge ultimately comes from experience, is ultimately justified by appeal to experience. And then, of course, we've got the rationalists who say, no, not all knowledge is justified by experience. There's some things that we know that are justified by appeal to thought alone. Now, the structure question about the options here are foundationalism versus coherentism. And these are really views about the nature of justification. So the foundationalist thinks that there are fundamentally justified beliefs that we appeal to in justifying all others. And the coherentist denies that, says, well, it's true that you appeal certain beliefs via others, but there is no sort of special set that justifies all of them. Some justifications lead to certain beliefs, other justifications lead to others, and it's more like a web or a coherent network of beliefs rather than a pyramid or whatever. So we haven't really talked about this all that much, not in any explicit detail, but I'll just tell you that the main authors we've read, including Hume, Locke, and Descartes, are all foundationalists of a kind. They all think that there are some fundamental beliefs that we appeal to when justifying others. So, and finally, skepticism, the view that in one way or another, we are more limited in our knowledge, especially knowledge about the world, than we often think. And this is a view that we seem to have been led to at every turn, right? Descartes didn't seem to get us beyond knowledge of the contents of our own minds at a moment, right? Had a hard time convincing us that we could go beyond that. He thought he could, but most people have disagreed that his arguments are all that convincing. So the empiricists come in, appeal to experience to maybe try to give us knowledge about the world, but lo and behold, with Hume and Locke, you seem to be...
Once again, all juniors should report to the Willis room.
Sorry.
Yeah, we're
announcement.
supposed to be there, but...
Is that it? All right. Does that apply to you guys? Do you guys have to go?
No, we got out of it.
Cool. Right. So we seem to be trapped behind like a veil of perception, right? These sensory ideas that we are immediately aware of, that, as it were, put a kind of curtain of perception between us and the world. So how do we have knowledge about the world around us on the basis of experience? Problems about induction that seem to limit our knowledge to the present, and various other things. So skepticism, we've had a hard time getting around it. And so I thought, we don't have time to really talk about this in a lot of detail, but I thought you might at least be interested in hearing what you need to do to avoid skepticism, and in particular, skepticism about the external world. Suppose you really think, look, sometimes I have knowledge about the world. How can I maintain that view in the face of these arguments that we've seen? Well, the first step is you've got to do something about these arguments that appear to show that there's a veil of perception between the mind and the world. And so a lot of these arguments work by saying, look, you're aware of some property, say a color or a shape, but then they try to argue in various ways that color or shape is not a property of a physical object. And so it must be a property of something else, a mental object, an idea that you're directly aware of, which then sort of is supposed to represent the world behind it, or something like that. We need to find an alternative view here. And some people think they have one. They tend to call it representationalism, but what you call it doesn't really matter. But the idea is that you can be directly aware of an object, and you can be aware of that object as having some property, say a color or a shape or something else, without anything literally having that property. Okay. The way to think about this is that you can read a story about this guy, Sherlock Holmes, who is characterized by various properties, like super intelligence, super amazing ability to see inferences or see patterns or something like that, right? So you can have thoughts about this guy, even though this guy does not exist. And there is no object, perhaps, that has the properties that you think of when you think of Sherlock Holmes as portrayed in these stories. So, works of fiction typically have this property where they lead us to have thoughts about things when nothing, literally nothing, has that property. Maybe I use more extreme examples, like the property of being a magician. Okay. Well, likewise, these views say about the sensory representation of color. So when you see an object and you perceive it to be red, or kind of a bluish, in your case, Jacob, it need not be true that anything has that property that you're aware of. And if nothing has that property, then you're not stuck with a kind of mental object that has that property. And it's no longer true that you have to be aware of the world by first being aware of this mental object that has the property, right? No, you're just directly aware of the physical object as having some property that nothing has. Okay? So, like with after images, right? You have the after image of the orange dot or whatever. The view is that nothing has that property of orange that you're aware of at all. So that can be a little hard to take. That can be a little hard to accept fully. But I think that you do need to hold a view that commits you to this. I think you do need to be willing to accept that if you're going to avoid these arguments for the veil of perception. Okay, that's one step. The second step is to adopt what's called an externalist or reliabilist theory of knowledge. This will allow you to avoid the dream argument or the evil deceiver arguments. So reliabilism or externalism about knowledge, very roughly the view is something like this. If you guys want to read more about this, there are papers in the textbook. But the view is something like this. The world is so constituted that there is usually a reliable connection between the presence of some object, say, we could use our example now. This is a kind of good example where we're interacting via these mechanical devices. And they're more or less reliable, right? When they are reliable, when everything's working properly, there is a relatively direct connection from me to you. I speak, you hear my voice, you raise your hand, I see it. Okay, there's a causal connection running both ways, and it's pretty reliable. We get good information from one another when it's reliable. Likewise with perception, there's a reliable causal mechanism that goes from the coffee cup, light to my eyes, visual experience of a certain kind that accurately represents the presence of a coffee cup. Boop, I get a belief that there's a coffee cup. Okay. Under those kinds of circumstances, when everything is working properly, your perceptual belief that there's a coffee cup before you, or that Dr. Wohlhagen is speaking, is true, and you're justified in believing it because of the presence of this reliable mechanism connecting your mental state to the world. Okay, that's the basic idea. All right. Now, if this is your view about justification, right? What justifies a belief is the presence of a reliable mechanism, and you're in the circumstances in which it is functioning reliably. The dream argument, the evil deceiver argument, doesn't work anymore, because just because it's true that you can think of a situation in which you would be having your current experiences, even though the world was not present, right? Just because you can think of that possibility doesn't mean that it's actual, right? The reliabilist is going to say, yeah, it's possible that you're in that circumstance, but if you're not in fact in that weird matrix evil deceiver circumstance, then your perceptual states are being caused by the world in this correct way, and that's what justifies the beliefs that you have on the basis of it. Now, I'll go to you in just a second, Jacob. This kind of view about knowledge is controversial, and it does require accepting that you can know something, namely that you're seeing a coffee cup or that there's a coffee cup in your environment, without knowing that you know it, right? You don't know that you know it because you don't know that the deceiver circumstance is not in fact occurring. And if it is, then you don't have knowledge. Okay. So you don't know that the circumstances that prevent knowledge are not present, and hence you don't know that you know. But you might nevertheless know that a cup is present. Okay. Go ahead, Jacob.
Okay, maybe I missed something, but isn't that argument just a little bit circular? Because to know that the whole mechanism is reliable, don't you need to be...
Okay, no, that's a good move, right? You're saying, but look, in order to know that the mechanism, so when you talk about the mechanism, what are you talking about? You're talking about the way the world is, right? And the way the world ordinarily runs.
Yeah.
It goes from object plus light to mental state to belief, right? Right. So your point is that to ever know that there could be such a reliable mechanism, you would have to be able to have the kinds of knowledge that the deceiver possibility is supposed to block. Now that's good. That's good. I think a reliabilist or an externalist is just going to say, no, that's true. You don't know that that there are these reliable mechanisms, but all they require is that there be such. And as long as there are, then we frequently have justified beliefs about the world. And hence we have knowledge, even though we don't know that we do. Yeah, you're not happy with this. That's fine. I just wanted to present, because we've seen all these arguments for skepticism, and you might be thinking, well, gosh, all epistemologists must be skeptics. In fact, that's not true. There are a lot of professional philosophers are reliabilists. They advance some kind of version of this theory. So, but that was a good objection. Yeah, Zach.
Are most professional philosophers skeptics?
It's very hard. It's very hard to say. Like I haven't done a survey or anything, so I can only rely on my impressions. So don't take this too seriously. I would say a good portion of professional philosophers are skeptics to some degree or another. Whether they... Yeah, I'd actually be interested in seeing data on this. I'd be interested, because when I've heard talks given by reliabilists, I've definitely had the sense that many in the audience were not convinced, which suggests that many are in fact skeptics, that they think there really is this problem with having knowledge. I mean, look, Descartes' evil deceiver argument is very persuasive. So that wasn't a very good answer to your question, Zach, but it's because I don't actually have the numbers to give you an answer. So, okay. All right. Well, let's move on now to the topic for today. And I thought I'd kind of couch it in these, it giving you sort of a new array of views about knowledge, about the status of our knowledge, the nature of knowledge. And the three are objectivism, relativism, and subjectivism. And we'll see this three-part division again when we get to moral theories. But yeah, I'll just lay this out real quick and then make a comment. So the objectivist is the person who thinks that when you know something, what you know, or the facts that make it true that you know something, are facts that hold independent of what different people happen to believe. That's what I mean when I say the facts that make it true that we know something are independent of anyone's say-so, right? Say-so here is the same as opinion, what people think. That's what it is to be an objectivist, right? The world is the way it is, independent of what we think. And in particular, when it comes to knowledge, whatever it is that makes it true that we know something is itself something that holds independent of what we happen to think about knowledge. The relativist denies this. So the relativist is someone who says we should still talk about what people know. We should still say that so-and-so knows such and such, knows that such and such is the case. But the facts that make it true that that person knows something are not independent of what different people think. They are not independent of somebody's say-so. And then there's the subjectivist who just denies that there's knowledge. There is no knowledge, there's only opinion. And one opinion is the same when it comes to justification and evidence and that kind of thing as another. So there's no knowledge, only opinion. That's the sort of the most radical denial of objectivism. And from the perspective of the interests of the philosopher, both relativism and subjectivism are varieties of skepticism about knowledge. They look like arguments or positions that would lead one to be skeptical about whether we really have knowledge, especially knowledge construed as the objectivist construes it. Okay. Now, I'm just about to turn it over to Zach, but I did think I would just distinguish between global and local relativisms. So global relativists are people who say who make the relativistic move about all facts, right? All facts are relative. No fact is objective. So that's a very extreme claim, and we'll actually look at Boghossian in his book, from which the reading for today was taken, talks about this global variety of relativism, but we're not reading that portion of the book. The reading for next time, for Wednesday, from Nagel is kind of about this global variety of relativism. Now, so we'll get to that. But it's important to note that you can reject global relativism while still adopting one of a variety of local relativisms, right? Relativism about a certain kind of fact, right? So you might reject global relativism, but accept something like relativism about aesthetics, right? About taste in music or taste in art, or you might be a moral relativist. We'll talk about moral relativism later. You might be a relativist about politics or maybe about science. And the view that we're going to talk about today is a variety of local relativism. It's a relativism about knowledge or justification. And it is important to note, though, that relativism, at least as being defined here, is supposed to be an alternative to subjectivism. It's supposed to maintain the claim that there is knowledge. It's just that knowledge is not objective. It's relative. It's relative to a conceptual framework as a common variety of relativism. So now, Jacob, I thought I would just respond to your question from your journal entry right away. You asked, does anyone believe this? Is this really? And that's a good question. And the answer is yes. Not only is it true that, all right, we got our, sorry, I shouldn't be doing this right now. I shouldn't be calling attention to what's happening. Not only is it true that some people accept this kind of relativism, a lot of people do. It's actually a very common view about knowledge. It's a very common view about morals. And it's sort of connected with this whole postmodernist movement in philosophy and other parts of culture. There are whole branches of science that at least claim to be committed to it. So sociology and anthropology, sociologists and anthropologists often claim to accept relativism of one kind or another. So people do believe this. Now, I say this, it's a little risky. You will encounter these kinds of views again when you go to college. You'll have classmates who advance these kind of views for various kinds of reasons. If there were one thing that I would actually want to succeed in convincing you guys of in this class, it would probably be that relativism is false. Now, I say that, and I know that you guys are sort of counter-suggestible. So you're, of course, going to want to fight back and maintain this view, and that's fine. But I actually think that it's kind of important to at least get a critical look. If you end up being a relativist, hey, what can I do? But I at least want you to be a relativist who has a critical eye, who doesn't just accept it because it's kind of the thing to believe these days. And I happen to think that a lot of people who are relativists because of that, and not for any good reason. So, anyway, there you go. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zach, who's put together a nice set of slides for us here on epistemic relativism. And so, Zach, you'll, like last time, just tell me when you want me to advance a slide.
So, epistemic relativism, and if you look at the slide, we have a picture of Galileo's trial, or at least it's what it's supposed to be. So, you can go to the next slide. Okay, so epistemic relativism was basically the belief that all the different epistemic beliefs about where you can get knowledge from and how you go about obtaining knowledge, like the scientific method or examining theological literature, were all equally valid, that none was objectively better than the other. And I have on here, one was science versus religion, and the thing that makes it somewhat harder to reflect is that everyone will say that their epistemic belief or system is objectively and inherently better than another. So some fundamentalists will say that examining theological literature is the only way to obtain knowledge and it's objectively the best. Whereas someone who is very into science and scientific examination will say that only rationality, looking at evidence from the universe around us, that is the only way to get knowledge. And it's a bit difficult for me to deal with this topic because I'm a little bit biased towards the whole scientific method aspect of it. So I can kind of see how people could argue that they're not objectively better than the other and that they're inherently equal, but that's something that I might try to give my opinion on why that might not be true a little bit later. But for now, you can go to the next slide. Bye.
And remember, guys, if you have any questions at any point, I'm assuming Zach's okay with that. Are you okay, Zach, with being interrupted?
Yes, I'd be happy to answer questions.
Whoops. Here you go.
Okay, so Bogosian gave two examples. One was Cardinal Bellarmine, and these were examples of people that do not use standard post-Enlightenment, post-Galilean European methods, which is the scientific method for determining knowledge. Bellarmine examines the Bible in order to obtain his knowledge. He was, here I have Galileo was an astronomer in the 1500s. He was a proponent of the Copernican system. He got in a little scuffle with the church and was then tried for heresy. He argued, using his observations through a telescope, that the church's view that the Earth was the center of the universe and everything circled around the Earth in kinds of crystalline spheres was incorrect. Bellarmine prosecuted him and said that if you read the scripture, it says that this is false, that the earth is fixed in a position, solid, that's where God placed it, it doesn't move. And Bogosian mentions that Galileo invited Bellarmine to actually look through his telescope, and he refused, saying that he only needed the scripture to make his argument. So that's the first one. As you can see, he does not use the scientific method, which is what we, as Western modern people, tend to view as the superior method of the superior epistemic system. But that's enough for this slide. Can you go on again? Thank you. And the second one was the Azande system, which anthropologists, maybe around Bogosian's time, maybe a little bit beforehand, I don't remember exactly what he said in his writing, but they'd been examining them. And I actually looked them up. They are a tribe in the South Sudan, or around that area in Central Africa. And they have a couple of beliefs that would be considered unusual and unscientific by the Western standard. One was a belief in witches, although they believe that witches were primarily men that had a substance in their stomach that they passed down to their male descendants, so it was a patrilineal inherited trait. And they also believed in the existence of oracles that could answer questions and tell the future. And an oracle acted in that it would poison a chicken, and depending on how the chicken died, it could answer yes or no questions. And they also had a somewhat unusual system of logic by Western standards. For instance, I mentioned earlier that they believed that witchcraft was passed down along male descendants. So if a witch was found, if Westerners, people who use standard Western logic, believed that there was such a thing as witchcraft, which was passed down along the male line, we would believe that if someone is found to, if a man is found to be a witch, then all of his male relatives would also be witches, because if you go back and back on their bloodline, eventually you get to the first witch who passed it all along. So the entire clan had to be witches. But the Azande would say that no, it is only the immediate male relatives of the man who is a witch would also be witches. So they just had a different way of interpreting logical arguments than us, which was kind of interesting. But that's enough with the Azande, and we can go on to the next slide, which basically, we have the scientific method slide, which basically Bogosian described the scientific method in a kind of grid that came about after Galileo. He refers to it as post-Galilean reasoning, and it had three primary parts: observational reasoning, which was we perceive things like we see something or we hear something, and that causes us to believe certain things depending on what we see. I guess if you're going to real epistemic skepticism, we can't necessarily use this, but if you're following the scientific method, then you do use this. Then you have deductive arguments, which are types of logic that we discussed earlier in the year: modus ponens, conjunction elimination, which I have forgotten what conjunction elimination was, but it's kind of simple. Bogosian writes, if you say that I am reasonably able to suspect that tomorrow it will be rainy and cold, you could also say I am reasonably able to suspect that it will be rainy tomorrow. You're just subtracting one of the conjunctions, but you're still, the other one still remains. Yes?
Yeah, so I just thought sometimes this rule is just called simplification. And the general form of it is from P and Q, you can infer P or you can infer Q. So.
Thank you. And he also had some others, which I think he classified under deduction, but I'm not exactly sure if they would be deduction or not. They were primarily inference to the best explanation, which I thought was inductive. It's not. Oh, okay. But he also talked about inductive reasoning as being one of the mainstays of Galilean beliefs. And he actually mentioned the arguments from past experience, which we talked about before break with Hume, who said that you can't be certain that just because something happened the way it did in the past, it'll happen the same way under the same circumstances in the future. So that's not deductive, but it's still kind of an inductive reasoning, and we use it a lot. It's pretty important if you're doing science where things have to be the same every single time. So those are the three. Yep.
Sorry, I won't interrupt too much, but the only little thing that I want to point out about this is I certainly don't disagree that these are principles that are employed in the what might now be called the scientific method, but it is definitely not true that these principles only came to be widely accepted or widely used with the development of the scientific revolution. I hope I'm not stealing a point that you were going to make, Zach.
No, thank you. That's a good point. I should have pointed out earlier. Actually, I completely forgotten to mention it. But yes, these have been things that have existed since humans could think. These are just parts of the post-Galilean grid that Boghossian writes about, but they're not just from post-Galilean epistemic systems. They're used by a bunch of different people. The Azande and Bellarmine probably used. I would be fairly certain they would use similar types of reasoning. They just had different foundational beliefs or different fundamental beliefs about what constituted places from which to gain knowledge. But yeah, these are pretty popular parts of epistemic systems, and I think he calls them fundamental principles of the post-Galilean system, but they're pretty popular fundamental principles of a lot of different epistemic systems. But that's about it for science.
Right. Yeah, no, and I just, in particular, if you look at Aristotle's work, ancient Greek philosopher, clearly committed to all of these. So, yeah. Okay, and the point that you just made, Zach, about Bellarmine almost certainly using these are things that Boghossian talks about in a later chapter where he's so in the chapter that we read for today, we have a defense of epistemic relativism. In the next chapter, if you guys looked at it, there's an attempt to reject it. And then there's a third chapter where he says, look, we've got this paradox. There's an argument for epistemic relativism. I presented an argument against it. So what do we do? And he tries to resolve the paradox. And that's where he kind of talks about whether it's really true that Bellarmine can be understood as having a really different epistemic system. But anyway, okay, moving along.
So Boghossian, and I forgot to say this guy's name earlier, but throughout his paper, Boghossian references Rorty, who's a previous philosopher that discussed a lot on this topic. I actually think he discussed Rorty's observations and discussions on the Azande. But basically, you might use Boghossian's name when I'm talking about Rorty's opinions. I'll try to be good about that, but you can point out if I say something glaringly incorrect in reference to what they believed. But he basically talks about Rorty in his opinion, or at least within this chapter, that you can't say that any of the Azandes or the scientific method or Bellarmine's methods, any of them are objectively better than the other. Because the people who use those methods will argue that theirs is objectively the best. And also, the epistemic knowledge that we claim comes from the scientific method. And you can't use things that you get from the scientific method to prove that the scientific method is better, because you can't be certain that this knowledge is true, because you're getting it from this relative epistemic system. He uses the phrase, which I like a lot, when we discuss how we argue our reasoning systems are the best, you can't use you can't use a reasoning system to argue for that reasoning system. That's not reasonable. It's kind of begging the question, and I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to say, at least in part, although the rejected chapter offers a different take on that, which I think is interesting. But we might get to that later if we have time. But basically, the final thing is there are no epistemic facts. And I believe after this, I have a slide asking if there are questions. I just wanted to give a few thoughts that I had reading the chapter that I didn't put on a specific slide because I didn't think they warranted it, and I wanted to get these out before we ask questions. So one of the things that Boghossian says is that it's kind of name-calling to refer to someone's beliefs as unscientific, because objectively they're not better than another. And I don't think this is necessarily false, but I think the way he looks at it isn't necessarily the way I look at it, because even though it's name calling in that saying something is unscientific is just a very subjective way of believing their ideas are false, technically it is unscientific because it doesn't follow the scientific method. And also, if someone uses the scientific method and they're looking at someone else's belief and they're talking with someone about it, it's important for them to know whether or not those beliefs are founded scientifically or if they're unscientific, because then they can know whether or not it would fit into their belief system, and it's a kind of a good way of quickening knowledge and learning about things more easily. But so even though I guess it is a kind of philosophical name calling, I think it's still an important form of name calling, I guess I would say. And okay, I think that it's all I want to say for this chapter. We can do questions, and then if we have time, I'll get into some things I like to say about the rejected section. But does anyone have questions? And I guess you can go to the next slide, which is basically, does anyone have questions?
Yeah, although I do, the one little thing, and it's this was a distinction that I kind of drew in my slides, so it's not too surprising that that you wouldn't have incorporated this distinction. So that final bullet there, no epistemic facts, strictly speaking, should be no absolute or objective epistemic facts, because the relativist is someone who wants to say, no, there are facts. It's just that they're not absolute, they're not objective. Now, of course, from an objectivist perspective, that sounds like saying there are no facts. but in fairness to the relativists, that's what they want to say. Also, I just thought that's an interesting remark you made about the name calling thing, because I kind of agree with you, Zach, that in some sense it's not name calling to say that something is unscientific, as long as you're not sort of merely using unscientific as a pejorative term, right? As long as you're not, in effect, saying it's nonsense, right? If all you're doing is saying, well, that's unscientific, right, with that kind of tone, then you're saying, well, that's nonsense. And then it does kind of become a name calling, because the person could respond, well, what's wrong with that, right? But you can use unscientific in a purely descriptive way, the way you suggested, right? No, that's unscientific in the sense that it's not justified on the basis of, the epistemic principles that science embodies. And in that case, it carries doesn't necessarily carry any pejorative meaning, but then you do want to inquire, well, could it still be rational, right? Okay. All right, guys, Oh, that's right. I asked Zach to add these things. So
sorry, I forgot it. So I have two slides, and these are the actual definitions that Boghossian uses to describe epistemic relativism. So I guess I'll just read it out, although you should already be able to see. But so there are no absolute facts about what belief a particular item of information justifies. So that basically means that you have information, but depending on what epistemic system you believe in, that information might justify certain beliefs, or it might justify other beliefs, and there's no objective way to determine what it actually justifies. And he also, the second point, if a person's epistemic judgments are to have any prospect of being true, we must construe his utterances in the form, according to the epistemic system C, that I, S, accept, information E justifies belief B. We can't simply say E justifies a belief B, because we aren't saying that I believe this system in which E justifies B, and it's too simplified otherwise, and it doesn't accurately reflect epistemic relativism and uncertainty. And then the third one, there are fundamentally different, generally alternative epistemic systems, but no facts by virtue of which one of these systems is more correct than any other. Epistemic pluralism. This just means that none of the epistemic systems are objectively better than any other. So these are just the very philosophical, very particular way of wording these that it's important to at least look at. And then we have the next slide, which is the argument for epistemic relativism, I believe. Yep. So if there are absolute epistemic facts about what justifies what, then it ought to be possible to arrive at justified beliefs about them. It is not possible to arrive at justified beliefs about what absolute epistemic facts there are. And I guess that kind of goes to what we talked about in previous lessons, where there's always a little uncertainty and skepticism in what we believe. And so therefore there are no absolute epistemic facts. If there are no absolute epistemic facts, then epistemic relativism is true, thus epistemic relativism has to be true. Because there are no absolute facts, then belief systems that support absolute facts can't be true. They have to be relative, not objective. So that is the end of the argument, and the next slide should be questions. Does anyone have any questions about what we've discussed so far?
Yes, yeah. Alexandra. Or I'll let you call on people, Zach. Sorry.
Yes, Alexandra.
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering, if you know, how widely accepted this, theory is currently, and also, what are, the main, or if you see any inconsistent, or what you think are the main inconsistencies in the argument?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing beforehand. I want to know why you think that it's false, and why you think that it's so important that we critically think about it that way. I guess.
Well, we'll get to why I think it's wrong. But in a way, the reason I want you to be critical is that this is a view that, so Alexandra, to respond to your question, it is very popular. A lot of people believe this. A lot of people believe this even in certain branches of science. So I mentioned sociology and anthropology before. But it's also very common to find this kind of view in the humanities. And part of the reason that I want you guys part of the reason that I like to take kind of a hard line on it is that I think very many people just go around asserting this kind of view without really assessing the case in favor of it. So what you guys are getting here is actually an argument for the position. But many people who espouse relativism, if you ask them, so why are you a relativist? They'll give you junk for an answer. Mm-hmm. They actually don't have very good reasons for accepting the position. It's just one of these things that it's almost a cultural thing that you believe this now. So it's for that reason. It's the uncritical acceptance of something that I think has pretty absurd consequences, frankly. That is, and I think it leads to a kind of intellectual laziness as well, because you no longer really need to engage with someone who differs from you, right? I don't need to engage with you. Well, you got your epistemic system, I got mine, and okay, I guess that's it, right? It's very it's lazy, and I think almost I wouldn't say disrespectful, but there's a way in which you don't need to respect another's opinion if you're a relativist. Yeah.
Well, I feel, aren't there for relativism seems, at least in my opinion, pretty true, and to believe otherwise, moral relativism, things like that.
Yeah, we'll get to moral relativism.
Should I not talk about this if it's about moral relativism rather than?
No, you can, but we'll talk about it again. Maybe that could be your day. Maybe that's what you should sign up for.
Yeah, I'll sign up for moral relativism. It just seems like, because think about were people in medieval times worse people than they were today because they had stricter ideas about punishment and about sort of like, or like child rearing or things like that. It seems like if you weren't a moral relativist, you would assert that people in the past were worse than people today because of like they were more prone to kill, like they valued human life less or things like that.
Okay, so it's possible that I'm sorry. Did you want to respond to this, Zach, or?
Or I just had a question. I can see that you support the idea of moral relativism, but do you support global relativism or epistemic relativism or just moral relativism?
I say that I support like I haven't necessarily really examined my belief on relativism other than moral relativism, so I don't really know, but I probably accept global relativism. Okay.
Well, personally, when we get to the moral, like the section in this class on moralism, morality, this will be an interesting discussion because I'm kind of think of myself as an objectivist in terms of morality, and I guess in my opinion, I never really thought about people in medieval times, but I think I don't think that they necessarily be bad people, but I'd say they did worse things. Because I can understand that they did these things because of the society they lived in. I don't think that excuses it, but I don't think that necessarily means that they were terrible people. But it's an interesting comparison. But I know we're not doing rejected today, but could I explain why I think that at least epistemically, in epistemic objectivism? Okay, so one of the arguments that Bogosian discusses in his rejected section has to do with the pluralism aspect, that his idea that there are, next one. I think it's the last, here it is, thank you. So that no epistemic belief is objectively true, but I disagree with his idea that there are no absolutely true facts because the Earth either revolves around the sun or it does not revolve around the sun. Schrodinger's cat is either alive or dead. That's just a joke on my part. That's an entirely different quantum physics thing that I'm not getting into because I do not know enough about quantum physics. But I do think that we can say certain things about the laws of physics and certain things about what is actually happening that they're objectively true, even if we don't know it. So maybe everything we see is the result of a malevolent person, like the liar we talked about in the past. But even then, you do have an absolute true fact. If you were to ask the question, say either the liar does exist or the liar does not exist, he exists. That is an absolutely true fact, even if we don't know it. So because of that, I would say that there are objectively true epistemic systems, or at least epistemic systems that are objectively better than others. We just might not know which systems these are. So that's my opinion. Do any of the three, do you have a response to that? Or Dr. Walligan, do you have anything to add or say?
No, I actually pretty much agree with what you just said, Zach. And we'll get to this in next class as well with Nagel's paper. And I think you're right also that the moral relativism discussion will be quite interesting. So I guess one thing to respond to what you suggested, Sam, look, an objectivist does not have to say that people in medieval times were bad. An objectivist could say that, you know what, actually medieval thinkers they were more latched onto the true moral principles. All the objectivist has to say is that when there is a moral disagreement, right, you say abortion is morally permissible, I deny it. All that the objectivist really has to say is that one of us is wrong. We might not know which, Objectivism doesn't require moral knowledge. It only requires moral facts. Just like an objectivist about the movement of the earth requires only that there be a fact of the matter, not that we know which it is. Now, you might think that that becomes a little uninteresting, and so if you might start to think that, well, okay, fine, I'm not a relativist about the facts, but maybe I am a relativist about the knowledge. And that's sort of what Boghossian's going after. That's what Boghossian is doing here, is he's talking about relativism about knowledge of the motion of the earth. So, Jacob, it looked like you might be starting to raise your hand.
Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't have. Okay, I'm just gonna say some things and see how they kind of come out. If there's only like one state of the world that we accept that it is, even if we don't know what it is, we accept that there's only one state of the world. Where am I going with this? How do people? Is it because people can come up with, if they use different epistemic systems, they might come up with different states of the different types of worlds. You see what I mean? Like if you go by the Bible versus you use science, you're going to come up with a different form of the world that you believe. But so is an objectivist only saying that there is one, but no system is better than the other? Sort of.
Well, I think most objectivists are not going to merely say that there is only one truth and no system. Because if you think there's one way the world is, then you have a kind of measuring stick for epistemic systems, right? The best epistemic system is the one that gets closest to the way the world is. Go ahead, Zach.
So say we had a book of infinite knowledge that the scientists of some alien race that knew everything wrote down in English, and there were two types of epistemic systems of knowledge. One was the scientific method, and the other was reading from the book of infinite knowledge. Would an objectivist argue, and they all came up with the same answers, would the objectivist argue that they're both equally valuable and usable and right? That neither is objectively better than the other?
That's a good example. Let's come back to this next time. Let's come back to this because it's time to go. I got to get to my next class. So, and I like that example. I'll have to think about what I want to say about it. But for next time, guys, the reading is this article from Thomas Nagel called "Why We Can't Understand Thought from the Outside." It's on eCollege. I highly recommend that you also read the one that's called Introduction, because it's a little hard to understand Nagel's paper if you don't read the introduction. You can, but I recommend reading the introduction. I also recommend the other chapter from the reading from Boghossian, Epistemic Relativism Rejected. It's a nice kind of counterpoint to the argument of this chapter, especially if like Sam, you find yourself inclined towards relativism. I think it's important to see what might be what Boghossian himself says in response to the argument he gave. So for the journal entry, I want you to just briefly summarize Nagel's overall argument against the subjectivist / in defense of objectivity, and just tell me which point or points, but keep it to 2 or 3 of Nagel's you find the most convincing and why. And then your usual 2 to 3 questions. Okay, so Sam, I'm just gonna sign you up for the moral relativism day, and I'll let you know what that is. So that's good. Okay, cool. All right, guys, welcome back. Good to see you again. I'll see you Wednesday.
Bye.
Later.
You guys are